But to put the perspectives, carry on with this perspective of why the tribunals didn't consider conscience to be a special case, if we look at a typical day, perhaps not typical, a typically busy day during one of these spikes that we saw on Jim's graphs of military exigencies in France or wherever, inclining the centre to inform tribunals, look, we really need you to be strict. We need you to be harsh, relatively harsh over the next few weeks. And absent specific legislation to that effect, there were plenty of suggestive missives that went out in local government board circulars to that effect. So on one of these days and one of these periods, a busy urban tribunal might process as many as 40 or 50 cases in a single sitting. They heard heart-wrenching stories of men being the sole support of 10 children and a sickly wife, of a boy whose widowed mother relied upon his wages to survive, of someone who'd adopted his brother's children because his brother had died in France, of the last skilled man in a business whose removal into the army would force the closure of that business and the dismissal of its ancillary workers. At times when the army's manpower emergency was less acute, some of these plights could be accommodated. At other times, they had little choice but to be rigorous. They were being pushed from behind to get as many men into the army as possible. In either case, whether it was one of these periods or not, a man who came before them in the midst of such stories to state that he would collaborate in no way with the nation at war was not likely to be heard sympathetically, because the tribunals knew their audience, and that audience was not like us. Each of them had or knew someone in uniform already, or dead or injured perhaps. If they were women, they'd probably experienced the wonderful liberation of working full-time in a factory for 9 hours and then going home to look after their families for want of a husband to help. Everyone was living a crisis that 2 years earlier would have been beyond the imagination of H.G. Wells. Therefore, sympathy with pacifism, other than a few atypical pockets around the country, we know about Huddersfield, I understand Cheshire was similar, places usually that had a strong non-conformist tradition could be relatively sympathetic to conscience. And even then, when I say relatively, it would still be a small minority in any borough. In this respect, it's more important to note that the tribunals more closely reflected the prejudices of the communities than those of the military, who certainly didn't want conscientious objectors in uniform. Conscience was a troubling issue for the tribunals, not least because there was no solution that would satisfy the applicant without creating resentments elsewhere. It came down to this, basically. What practical or legislative mechanism could rate a man's conscience more highly than it did another man's 10 children?